And so what happened after World War I was that everybody wanted war to be done with. The people who believed the propaganda that this was a war to end wars wanted to follow through on that. And the people who never believed the propaganda really wanted to follow through on that. And everybody wanted to end war. And war was seen as a backward foreign European thing. The United States had been dragged into it. Right? We wanted the Europeans to buy more of our grain and farm produce and fewer weapons. The financial interest was against war to a great extent in this country. So the military-industrial complex was not the hurdle that it is now. But you had a sort of a split that we might think of as libertarian and progressive. You had, or as they called it, isolationist and internationalist. And you had those who didn't want anything to do with the sort of entanglements that had gotten us into World War I, who would have been against something like NATO. And you had those who wanted all sorts of foreign treaties and entanglements and wanted a world court and wanted all sorts of international proposals. And so you got nowhere for about a decade after World War I. You had disarmament conferences that just produced cynicism and armament. You had the World Court shot down by the United States Senate, as many other things were. I mean, the United States Senate, the people who brought us the Civil War, that has, this is the highest hurdle for anything good or just in the history of the world since the United States Senate has existed. I mean, it ought to be abolished. It was not in the original plan. And so you had a peace movement that got nowhere until these two sides of the peace movement held formal negotiations and agreed and signed agreements between the two of them to help each other. And the biggest agreement came around a proposal for something called outlawry, started by a lawyer out of Chicago who had friends many of us have heard of, like Jane Addams, who were in on this, but whose name almost nobody has heard of, Salmon Oliver Levinson. And his idea was to make war illegal, because up through World War I it had been perfectly legal. Certain atrocities had been illegal, just as Amnesty International thinks of the world today. That was how everybody thought of the world up through World War I. But Levinson wanted to make war illegal. And he said, we've made blood feuds illegal, we've made child abuse illegal, we've made dueling illegal, and we didn't just get rid of aggressive dueling and keep defensive dueling and devote our energies to preparing for dueling. We said, this is barbaric. We're not going to use that way of settling disputes. And war is next. War is going to be set behind us. And we're not going to ban the non-humanitarian wars and the non-responsibility to protect wars and the non-defensive wars and the non-UN Security Council approved war. We're going to ban wars, period, all of them. We're going to make them illegal. And war is not going to vanish the next day. We're going to set up an international court. We're going to set up standards of behavior. We're going to arbitrate disputes. We're going to prosecute violators. And through this process of stigmatizing war and building alternatives to war, we're going to get away from it. And they did. They did. If you remember this song that came out in 1950, last night I had the strangest dream I ever dreamed before. That happened. This is not a future fantasy. This is something that happened. The room full of men, and it was men, and there were women protesting outside, and I would have been with them. Paris, France, August 27th, 1928. Major nations of the world banned war with the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which remains on the books today, 84 member nations. Every war since 1928 has been illegal under this treaty, which under Article 6 of the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So this huge coalition, this uncomfortably large coalition, actually managed to get this thing done. And the Secretary of State, Frank Kellogg, managed to offend all of his underlings at the State Department who thought he didn't really mean it when he started talking about this proposal. The nation of France, which really wanted a bipartite agreement, just the two nations, the United States and France, to drag the United States into the next war that France might be in, got pushed into making it open to all nations. And every attempt by senators and others to make it about only aggressive war was stopped. And the treaty, as it is on the books, requires that nations settle all disputes by pacific means alone, and renounces all war, all forms of war. 85-1 was the ratification vote in the United States Senate. The one senator who voted the wrong way was censured by his state legislature when he got home. The half-dozen senators who gave great speeches against the peace pact and then voted for it explained to reporters that they wished not to be lynched when they got home. There was no public advocacy for lynching in this movement, by the way, but there was intense public pressure. And this was the biggest news story of 1928. I mean, this was the top of the news. This is not secret CIA history. It's intentionally buried, forgotten history. There are people going into court in Syracuse and giving my book about this law to a judge and explaining why they must protest drone murder in order to uphold the law, not to violate the law. And going back so many times that they can now talk to the judge who appears to have actually read the thing. And the judge is incredibly stimulated and interested because the whole entire rest of his life is just deadly boring. And so he's not yet there, you know, but they're bringing him around. There's an essay contest started by a group in Illinois to get students to write essays on how can we uphold the law against war, that now has hundreds of entries, and I've started reading them, and they're wonderful. There's a group in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the big road along the river is called Kellogg Boulevard, and everybody thinks, you know, it's about cereal or something, is working on getting the city council to make August 27th a Kellogg-Briand Day and put up banners along the boulevard and so forth, but actually got their congressman a couple of weeks ago to put in the congressional record this recognition that in fact under US law, war is illegal. As I propose in the book that we make August 27th a holiday for peace, and so there are people gathering petition signatures around the country on that. But my idea is primarily to make use of a law like that one. You know, when people in this country want to make it legal for corporations to buy elections, they cite things like marginalia scribbled on the side of the minutes of court proceedings. And they, oh, this is sort of a law. When John Yoo wants to make it legal to torture, he cites, you know, Nixon's veto of the War Powers Act, even though the veto was overridden. He cites speeches that George W. Bush gave. You know, none of the stuff he cites is actually law. On our side, we have laws that go miles beyond what we could possibly dream of legislating if we started anew. I mean, imagine trying to get the world's nations led by the US State Department and the US Congress to ban war, you know. But it's already been done. And it was done hypocritically, and the poor nations were not on board. But they can join now. And they can join just by sending a letter to the US State Department. There's nothing else involved, and they can demand that the other parties to the treaty begin complying with it. But the extent to which there has been compliance is also dramatically overlooked. When this treaty was passed, wars ended, wars were prevented, and when World War II happened, something else happened too. A guy named Franklin Roosevelt pulled out the Kellogg-Briand Pact and said, let's prosecute the crime of making war. And because we can do that, we can prosecute everything else. Now, this was one-sided, victor's justice, you know, very, very limited. You can say many things against it. But war was prosecuted as a crime for the first time. And since that day, the big armed nations of the world have not gone to war with each other again. We have not had World War III. We've had endless wars on poor countries. All right, we've had endless proxy wars, but we've not had World War III. And so to that limited extent, it's as if we banned drunk driving, and then the first guy who drove drunk, we prosecuted him and nobody drove drunk anymore. And well, that didn't work. We got to legalize drunk driving. I mean, this is the response to the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It didn't work. This is what people will tell you. World War II happened, so what foolishness that was to try to ban war. We must legalize war now, which is what the UN Charter did. It legalized war. The UN Charter created a couple of big loopholes for war. One is wars the United Nations likes. Another is wars that are defensive. And as you all know, going halfway around the globe and destroying an unarmed, impoverished nation is defensive. And getting the United Nations to say you can go rescue people in one town in Libya is authorization to overthrow the government of Libya. These loopholes get stretched predictably, and it was predicted. And so if you're going to argue, as many do, that the UN Charter outdates the Kellogg-Briand Pact because it's more recent, you have to come to a different understanding than most people have of what the UN Charter did. And so when we go into court and tell the judge, I had to commit this act of resistance in order to uphold the law, mention the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It's stronger than the UN Charter. You know, when Francis Boyle successfully went to the World Court and prevented an attack on Libya a quarter century before it finally happened, he cited the UN Charter, but he also cited the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It is the strongest law that we have.